Subtitling Zweites Deutsches Fernsehen 02/13/2026. We are in the fourth year and on day 355 since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Welcome, I greet you. On the situation report, in today's report we see how the Ukrainians continue to destroy Russian communications. What the situation looks like in a heavily contested area that actually seemed pretty calm at first glance, what Ukraine is currently lacking again, and much more. Kostiantynivka. Let's take a look there right away. We are in the Donetsk region, the soldiers of the Ukrainian 28th Mechanized Brigade, which we can see here on the situation map roughly in the northern part of the city. After more than 137 days, they have left their positions, but they have not retreated. This is a rotation. The Ukrainian army relies heavily on rotation so that units can regroup, re-equip, and recover in the rear areas. On the Russian side, it's often the case that some units stay in the same section of the front for years, but are repeatedly replenished at the front. The Ukrainians use a different approach. They send their soldiers back to the rear to replenish them there, but for that they need another unit to take over at the front. Both systems have their pros and cons. For example, the Russians have the big advantage that the units at the front, especially the command staff, always remain the same. And theoretically, they always have the situation up to date and always have an overview. He knows the positions, he knows the enemy movements, he might even know the commanders on the opposite side, and also the subunits nearby. They have often worked together, they have carried out attacks together, so they know each other, and they have been able to coordinate together several times. You know what works well, you know what doesn't work, you know where you can attack, you know what the drone situation is, but for that, you have extremely high losses. You have a team that keeps getting worn down, that doesn't have the highest morale here. They hardly ever get to go on leave or have any change from the daily life at the front, while new people who are fresh keep joining the unit, coming to the front, usually very inexperienced, and then maybe don't have such a high chance of survival. On the Ukrainian side, it's exactly the opposite. The units there aren't stationed at the same section of the front for as long as on the Russian side. They get rotated, which means another unit takes over for them. Of course, this has the big advantage that your own soldiers have higher morale, they have more energy, and equipment and supplies can be reordered more or less safely in the rear. You can look forward to a short rest and also replenish new personnel over a longer period of time, and then retrain them based on the lessons learned at the front. The downside, on the other hand, is that another unit takes over all the positions, which they might not be familiar with, because they themselves are just coming back from front leave or have been transferred from another section of the front. That means at the front, there's a kind of loss of information or a kind of loss of experience between the units. If one unit, which holds certain positions or has specific knowledge about the area or the enemy, that knowledge could be lost or not properly communicated. And so the new unit that's there is more or less inexperienced in that section of the front, while an experienced unit leaves. So, as I said, it has both its advantages and disadvantages. The Russian side has decided on this approach, while the Ukrainian side prefers a more regular, more frequent rotation. Even though this one lasted 137 days, that means they arrived in September 2025 and were relieved now in February 2026. Of course, all of this sounds very matter-of-fact, but 137 days on the same front line means absolute stress and constant strain. For months, they were under constant surveillance by Russian drones. Every path, every movement, every rotation was very risky. The sky is never really empty, the nights are never truly quiet, and life is never really safe at the front. Winter has made the situation even worse. Lower temperatures, wet positions, hardly any infrastructure. According to reports, the soldiers kept warm with candles, a rather simple method that quickly became the most important source of heat in the trenches. Sleep, dryness, privacy, all of that remains more of a luxury and is scarce. Such long periods of defense are extremely demanding, both physically and mentally. It's not just about combat, but about enduring, staying alert in the cold, in the dark, and persevering in an environment that constantly signals danger. The relief, after 137 days, is therefore more than just a normal troop rotation. It marks the end of a long period in which this unit held the line under drone pressure, in winter conditions, and without operational relief. In a war of attrition, it is exactly these phases that determine stability or collapse at the front. So let's take a look at the area. Speaking of stability, the Russians keep attacking, and most of the attacks are being held off by these two units, the 103rd and the 78th. Motorized rifle regiments. They usually attack across the yellow area here. It's still unclear whether the Ukrainians or the Russians fully control this village here. There are geolocations from both sides in both villages. What we know is that the Russians have already reached this point. The Ukrainians were last seen about on the opposite side of the street. I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, if I remember correctly. On the Ukrainian side, we have a large variety of units. We have many mechanized units with us. Mechanized units, for those who are new and don't know, are units, because I like to repeat that. Mechanized units are units that have vehicles they can use to go into battle. That's basically the highest quality infantry you can have. For example, they have infantry fighting vehicles, can attack with their vehicles, and actively use them in combat, while also having infantry. The infantry either moves alongside the vehicles or rides into battle with them. And then we also have motorized units. This is this symbol here, which is similar because it's infantry that has vehicles, but they're not suitable for attack, for example, regular troop transports, without heavy weapons or even trucks. And no one would drive into an assault with a truck except for the Russian side, as we've seen very often in this war. But that's normally regular motorized infantry. Otherwise, here are 3 battalions from the military police. They're still from the fighting around Torres near Torres. It was held by military police units for what felt like 50 or 60% of the time until the place was eventually lost. They all gathered here in the north, then tried to hold back the Russians, didn't succeed, and were pushed back. They're now up here near Kostiantynivka. So they weren't brought here specifically, they came from a previous battle. Also, we still have the 501st, which is marked incorrectly here. It's actually the 501st Battalion of the 36th Marine Infantry Brigade. So very high-quality infantry is also fighting here. And with the 501st, it's like this. They are very, very often involved in direct combat, very, very often at the front lines. When they are relocated here, they usually aren't sent on frontline leave during rotations, but instead are just moved to another section of the front. It's hard to imagine, right? The 5th Assault Brigade, which is also on site, one of the very well-known brigades on the Ukrainian side, about as well-known as Azov, or the 93rd Brigade. That means the Ukrainians have brought in quite a lot here, including some new units, like the 156th Brigade, the 156th Mechanized Brigade. It was co-founded as part of the reorganization of the Ukrainian army. There was some criticism because during the summer offensive of 2023, they created Brigades 150 to 155, and these were hardly filled up. The first 2 brigades received Western equipment and tanks and all sorts of things, and the other 4 of these brigades, basically the 152nd, up to 155, they more or less came up empty, had old Soviet vehicles or sometimes almost no vehicles at all. Shortly after that, the new brigades, the 156th, 157th, and so on, were founded, which made no sense at all. And that's when Syrskyi also faced heavy criticism, because he kept founding new brigades, while the old ones were maybe only at 50 to 60% of the strength they were supposed to have. And of course that makes no sense, because every brigade doesn't just consist of combat units. A brigade might have 3, 4, maybe 5 combat battalions at most. The rest are all support groups, for example, a medical group, an artillery platoon, an air defense group, and of course a bunch of staff and logistics personnel, which are essential. When you keep founding a new brigade, you also need these support units in addition to the combat units. Then they're missing from other brigades, which are already short on personnel. That's a very, very big problem. But what we have here, as I said, is a very, very young brigade, at least if you go by the founding date. And otherwise, there's everything that's marked with an L. In the end, that's light infantry, which in Ukraine is mainly used for territorial defense. that usually also has the marker territorial defense after it. These units specialize in defense, which is how they're holding the city. Things look good so far, with a lot of fighting happening here. We'll discuss that shortly. But so far, it's not so bad for the Ukrainians. The Russians can't advance from the north or the east, and they're also not able to make any further progress here. This part of the city is always contested, but it's not so bad that the Russians can gain a foothold here or bring in new reinforcements across the open fields. But what we do have down here is a Russian gain. This one didn't happen overnight. It developed over the past 1.5 weeks. The Russians were able to advance a bit further there, and here are two positions that we've already looked at very closely in a previous situation report, which defend this route here to protect Zenternivka from the southwest. And what looks like a rather mild battle on the map is actually not the case, because the fighting is still intense. Here, for example, you can also see a clip from a video where a Ukrainian soldier clears out a Russian foxhole that was in the fields just outside the city. And these are battles that are not carried out by drones, but by infantrymen. Likewise, the Ukrainian 100th Brigade, which we can also see here on the situation map down here in this area, has reported successful hits against Russian forces. According to their own statements, 3 vehicles, a buggy, a quad, 8 antenna systems, as well as 4 Russian soldiers, were hit. What stands out is the choice of targets, as the focus is mainly on antennas in addition to vehicles. This means, of course, that it's not just about movement on the battlefield, but also about the targeted destruction of Russian communications. In a section of the front like this, which is located right next to a contested city, especially after the restrictions under Stalin, many Russian units are resorting to improvised radio solutions. And those require exposed antennas, and those are now being systematically targeted. Light vehicles like buggies and quads are also playing a major role now. They're used for quick liaison runs, drone teams, or small assault squads. Their destruction directly affects mobility. Reports like these are typical of the current nature of the war. It's less about large tank units and more about mobile small groups, drones, radio technology, and targeted strikes against infrastructure right at the front lines. Every destroyed antenna and every disabled vehicle has a direct impact on coordination and speed. At this point, I want to thank all channel members once again. It's only thanks to the help of channel members of the Algo crew, and of course some subscribers, that you can watch these videos here every day, now even up to Saturday. NATO needs to take a very close look at what Ukraine has learned in this war. I've said that many times already, since future wars will certainly build on the results of the Ukraine war. And by certainly, I mean obviously. That's what became clear during the Hedgehog 2025 exercise, which is now showing its first results. We already took a look at it back in May. It was teased back then, but now we have results that we can actually talk about. More than 16,000 soldiers from up to 12 NATO member states trained under realistic conditions. The simulated opponents were Ukrainian drone pilots. The goal of this exercise was to create a battlefield characterized by a constant drone threat, aerial reconnaissance, kamikaze drones, rapid target changes. The units were supposed to operate under constant pressure and test their responsiveness. The result was very sobering for many observers. Within a single day, a comparatively small Ukrainian team simulated the destruction of up to 17 armored vehicles. Additionally, more than 30 targets were successfully attacked. In the exercise evaluation, this effectively amounted to the elimination of 2 entire NATO battalions in a single afternoon. Of course, the assessment of the Ukrainian side itself was particularly significant. The operators involved stated that they hadn't even used their full intensity during the exercise, and more or less just claimed control of the battlefield situation for themselves without resorting to any great tricks from their toolbox. At the real front in Ukraine, the drone density is significantly higher than during this exercise. The tactics are extremely aggressive, and we see that with Russian attacks as well as with Ukrainian attacks. And the pace is even much higher. The situation is much more dangerous. That's the real core of this matter. Ukraine has developed drone warfare under extreme pressure, which is based on mass, speed, and constant presence. And the Russians have developed a similar kind of drone warfare, especially in the area of small first-person view drones. Vehicles, positions, and logistics are almost constantly monitored, Any movement can be detected and attacked within minutes. For NATO, this means a clear lesson. Classic combat formations, concentrated vehicle gatherings, and rigid logistics lines are highly vulnerable in an environment with ubiquitous drones. Adaptation is possible, but it requires structural changes in training, equipment, and doctrine. The exercise was therefore less an embarrassment than a warning. Anyone fighting an opponent today who uses drones in this density, and both the Ukrainians and the Russians do, must completely rethink their entire understanding of combat. And we're not talking about a Russian attack in a few years or about a Ukrainian attack, which some Russians always want to predict, but which is practically impossible. But we're talking about a different dimension now. Russia's investing a lot of money in drone development and has brought North Korea on board. They now have their own drone development centers in North Korea, the North Koreans, and they're also building drones for Russia. China is doing the same, just for itself. They see the war. They may not be actively developing in this war, but they see what drones can do and have copied many of them, while at the same time heavily rearming. Just imagine if we ever found ourselves in a fight against China. Purely hypothetically, they would have access to an enormous drone arsenal, while we would still be trying to figure out how we even want to defend against drones. Adapting is important, even if we are not in an active war. Starting only after a war begins would be so bad that we might as well not bother, even though no one wants that. Ukraine, however, has gone through a learning process under fire. NATO can follow this in training. That is a big advantage, but it should also be taken very seriously for that reason. After the shutdown of numerous Starlink terminals, Russian units are apparently facing significant communication problems and are now increasingly resorting to radio relays and directional Wi-Fi technology. In newly released footage, a Russian soldier can be seen openly bragging about it. How to bypass the Starlink blockade using so-called radio blockades, often devices from a United States manufacturer. The background is a technical change at Starlink. The system now operates using a whitelist. Terminals only work in Ukraine if they have been officially registered. As a result, the Russian units abruptly lost a central component of their combat communications. Starlink connections are vital at the front for drone control, coordination, and situational awareness. As a replacement, directional antennas and Wi-Fi bridges are now apparently being used more frequently. And this has the big advantage for the Russians, that they are cheaper, more readily available, and relatively easy to install. However, it also has clear limitations: short range, high susceptibility to interference, and above all, a strong dependence on fixed positions. While Starlink internet or satellite internet is mobile and hard to locate, radio relays produce clearly identifiable signatures. Even fairly radical Russian groups at the front, which we looked at recently, have announced that they want to switch to such solutions, noting that a Russian satellite alternative simply doesn't exist, and that's why they have to use these. And that's quite remarkable because, once again, Russia's structural dependence on Western or civilian technology is being exposed. But we already know that. The problem, however, is that Ukraine has now responded again, and that's a problem for the Russian soldiers on the ground. Because in recent footage, drone attacks on radio relay bridges near the front can be seen, just like we saw before with the satellite supply line. And such installations are relatively easy to locate, and their destruction is immediately noticeable. If a radio relay bridge fails, the connection in the entire sector collapses. The pattern is clear. Ukraine is focusing more on destroying communication. First Starlink, now radio relay bridges, and maybe the next alternative after that. Every technical environment creates new vulnerabilities. Modern warfare depends on stable data connections. And if this chain is broken, it doesn't just affect individual units, but the entire coordination at the front, especially drone coordination in this war. And as we know, that's extremely important. So new methods are needed, and these first have to be implemented by soldiers. Here, for example, we see a Russian field radio operator being hit by a first-person view drone while he's trying to install a relay station on a high-voltage mast, which is used for a Wi-Fi bridge, so basically a classic directional antenna. For these systems to work reliably, the antennas have to be mounted as high as possible, and anyone who has to climb high up on a power pole puts themselves in danger, not because of the voltage, since large parts of the Ukrainian power grid have been destroyed by the Russians, but rather because he's unprotected, clearly visible, and barely able to move. In a combat zone that's constantly monitored by drones, that's obviously very risky. Drones can be used to target individual people. Height isn't protective here. It actually makes him more visible. Most importantly, the incident reveals a key dilemma. To restore their own communications, Russian units now have to venture out of their hiding places. They have to use fixed, exposed infrastructure, and this is easy to detect and attack. And of course, it's also somewhat predictable where they'll try to set up such antennas. So every technical workaround creates vulnerabilities, and the war over data connections has become its own front line. Whoever doesn't have stable communication loses coordination and responsiveness, and those who improvise or set things up put people at high risk. And we know ourselves that with an injury rate of over 90% from drones, the drone war means that every minute you stand out in the open is a real danger of getting killed. So what we've been able to see very clearly is that for several days now, Russian communications have been deliberately targeted. They want to prevent the Russians from communicating at the front at all costs. And communication isn't just the key in a good relationship, but especially at the front. In drone warfare, if you can't communicate, you can't react. If you can't react, you lose the fight, and if you lose the fight, eventually you lose the war. I assume that this is currently benefiting the Ukrainians a lot, since they are launching a new offensive or have planned several new offensives in 2026, or at least have announced them. And if it's the case now on the Russian side that they can hardly communicate anymore, or at least communicate worse than before, then that would be the perfect opportunity to prepare and also carry out one or another offensive on some sections of the front, for example in Zaporizhia, as I announced yesterday, as long as this situation continues. Zelensky is demanding a quick and extensive delivery of anti-aircraft missiles from European partners. The background is the ongoing heavy Russian airstrikes on Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. In a video message from Kyiv, he emphasizes that this is not just about Ukraine's security, but that strengthening air defense is also a central task for all of Europe. Russian missiles and so-called Shahed drones must not become a normal, calculable means of warfare. The message is clear. Russia continues to rely on airstrikes to put pressure on the civilian population, energy supply, and military infrastructure. Every successful defense not only reduces immediate damage, but also sends a signal. If attacks get through regularly, it creates a sense of operational routine for Moscow. For Europe, this means a strategic decision. Air defense systems and missiles are limited in availability and extremely expensive. At the same time, they are an effective lever to neutralize Russian attacks. Ukraine has apparently received commitments for 35 new Patriot interceptor missiles. The delivery is supposed to happen in the short term, which is already good, so within a few days. This is an important signal in light of the ongoing Russian attacks, even though 35 missiles will probably be fired in 1 or 2 evenings and then be used up again. According to sources close to the Ukraine contact group, Germany is providing 5 more Patriot advanced capability, 3 missiles. Another 30 will come from other partners. The announcement was made during the so-called Ramstein talks at NATO headquarters. And that's a bit difficult because if you get 35 missiles for the system, but the Russians attack every day with usually 200 to 400 drones, then of course it's hard to keep the stockpile full. But you also have to say the number 35 doesn't seem large at first glance, and it really isn't. But each missile can protect a strategically important facility or a densely populated area in an emergency. And if you can use them to protect some energy producer or some really expensive important infrastructure 35 times, then it's already been worth it in some way. Thank you to all subscribers, channel members, and the Algo crew, especially Colonel Draneka, Robert Siller, Dietrich, Freddie, and Mehrthofer. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next stock report.